Welcome to Sea of Stories, a podcast for children and their caregivers by the Ocean County Library.
Hello, and welcome to the Ocean County Library's Sea of Stories podcast. My name is Chris, and I'm a librarian at the Ocean County Library System. Also joining me today is Dan from our Ocean County Library's Public Relations Department. We're so honored to be interviewing today children's author Jen Malia. For those who may not know, Jen Malia is the author of the children's books Too Sticky, Sensory Issues with Autism, the Infinity Rainbow Club series, and the forthcoming picture book, June Solar Oven. These books focus on neurodivergent children and showcase to readers that children's of all abilities matter. Jen has a vast experience on this topic. She is neurodivergent and is also a mom to 3 neurodivergent children. In July, as part of the Ocean County Library's celebration of Disabilities Pride Month, we'll be hosting Jen Malia for an author visit tour. Jen will be visiting the Barnegat and Jackson branches on July 7th, followed by a visit to the Island Heights and Long Beach Island branches the next day on July 8th. And so, without further ado, I welcome Jen Malia to the Sea of Stories podcast. So thank you, Jen, for coming today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, Jen, thanks for joining us. So our first question is, what are your fondest memories of using the library, whether for yourself or with your children?
Yeah, I have a lot of fond memories of libraries. I was an undiagnosed autistic girl growing up. I didn't realize till I was an adult that I was on the spectrum. And so one of the main ways that I communicated as a child is writing and then also reading, because reading was how I took in information and writing was how I put it out, and I did not talk very much. So for me, going to the library was like the best thing ever. I would be in my elementary school library, getting books all the time. And then when I had my kids later on, we would go to the public library all the time to check out the latest books. And it was a bit later after that, though, but not too much after that, that I started writing picture books. And so, it was really exciting when we went to our public library and my kids were able to point out my books and say, look, mom wrote this book, because it's just, and then I donated them also to our school libraries. So then their classmates got to check them out. So, I absolutely love the libraries and I'm really excited to be here.
That's awesome.
Wonderful. Our second question is, how has the library inspired you?
Yeah, I think so I have a pretty decent collection of books. You can see them behind me if you're on watching the video, but I actually spend quite a bit of time in the library because there's no way that I can get all the books my kids want or all the books that I want. And so the library is just this like unlimited sort of we'll use interlibrary loan if we need to. We can get any access to any book that we need. So the library's been just unbelievably useful for all the research that I've had to do over the years. Whether it's for a picture book or, even fiction books need research. I had a lot of dinosaur research I needed to do for one of my chapter books. So there's just, everything from the sources that I need for the factual information to just looking at different mentor texts, like other picture books that are trying to accomplish things that are similar to what I'm trying to work on. The library has just been invaluable for that.
Oh, wonderful. We love to hear that. That's great.
Yeah, we do. Awesome. Next question. Growing up, what author or authors influenced your writing style?
Yeah, that's really interesting because there's just so many when I started out, I was an academic before I started writing. So I was writing for academic audiences before I started writing newspaper and magazine essays. And then I sort of moved into even reported articles. And then, I started writing more fiction. So it's interesting that, my writing has been influenced, by a variety of different writers. So one that really stood out as sort of a favorite author, and it's not related to the kind of book I'm writing, but just the idea of having a satirical kind of tone. I love Jane Austen. I teach Jane Austen in my literature courses. I'm a professor at Norfolk State, and so I draw on. I feel like even though it was written so long ago, and we're talking about like a 19th century books written in the 19th century still have the style is very different, but just the idea like bringing humor into the writing, like my chapter book series, even though it has a very sort of it has a message that's not something you would think of as being humorous, but a lot of the interactions that my characters have, my neurodivergent characters, my autistic boy main character in the first book, Nick, he is always, saying, in his thoughts, a lot of the things that, I try to bring humor into it. So I think that it's important to make, topics like I don't think books that are written about neurodivergent characters have to be like, oh, all the struggles they're having. And yes, there are challenges and struggles, but there's also humor. And I think that that also influences a lot of the writing that I do.
Yeah, and the humor probably brings more of a human element to the characters and makes them feel more well-rounded and realistic too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and humor is a common thing that everyone can latch on and understand and grasp right away because, we all have comedic moments in our lives.
It's a part of life, yeah.
Definitely. Well, speaking of bringing humor into an important topic, this leads into our next question. When writing your stories, how do you balance taking from your personal experience, a la the humor, versus creating something new?
Yeah, so what's interesting is because all of my books, I have four out and one coming out, they're all fiction, but in a lot of ways, they have a lot of nonfiction elements because even like scenes from Too Sticky, like there's a kitchen table scene where, there's sticky syrup, and that opening scene could be taken from just like a breakfast in my family, in my family home. So it may not be the exact details, the exact lines delivered, but it's a very, very sort of familiar kind of scene. And in my chapter book series, the same thing. There's a Lego room that's in my we have like a playroom that's filled with like tens of thousands of Legos. All three of my kids build Legos, and that's what a lot of the storyline is about. Building with Legos, challenges that they do. And so there's actually three siblings, and I have three kids, and the scenes that I wrote that were in the playroom were very much taken from my interactions or watching my kids interact with each other in the playroom. It's almost like I could have been just sitting in the room writing down what they said to each other, and all the fights that they would have, and then how they would resolve them or not. A lot of that sort of play is very much what kind of comes across in the manuscript. And I always think of it as like a lot of my characters are composite characters. Like they're not, so like the main character for Too Sticky, Holly, is very much based on, I have a daughter named Holly. And, a lot of it was influenced by her, but it also has a little bit of me and a little bit of my other kids because it's like there's certain traits that, one character might be mostly based on one person, but then there might be other aspects of their character that come from the experiences that I have with other family members or even just other neurodivergent people that I know.
Great.
Wonderful.
In your book, Too Sticky: Sensory Issues with Autism, in the author's note, you shared the personal story of how you and your daughter were both diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder on the same day. What was that experience like?
Yeah, so this is where it all started. So I mentioned I didn't know when I was growing up that I was on the spectrum. And I didn't know at first. It wasn't like just one day I woke up and I knew. It was that I had at that time I had three kids, and my middle child, my younger daughter, she had a language delay and was having a lot of other struggles, and I was determined to figure it out because I had taken her to multiple doctors who didn't know what to make of it other than she has a language delay. She didn't appear to them to be autistic, but it was one of those things that as I started doing research, I spent hundreds of hours just, having a PhD in English really prepped me for, just life experiences where you need to sometimes do your own research. And so I did. And, after doing all that research, I believed that she was on the autism spectrum. I didn't know much about it at all before I started doing that research. My sort of perception of autism was Rain Man. Like I didn't know
Mm.
anything about autism. So it was really quite an eye-opening thing for me to read and understand. Like I read also like personal stories that some essays that autistic people had written. And that really led me down the path of discovering that not only was my daughter autistic, but that I was too. So I had already come to that conclusion when I took her to a different sort of clinical psychologist who had been trained, or had been more open-minded for especially the gender differences with autism and how sometimes women and girls present differently. They may not do as much flapping or they may have more eye contact. A lot of the kind of stereotypes that we think about with autism aren't necessarily the experiences that everyone has. And so it's really just, we really only see the sort of tip of the iceberg. A lot of what autism is the things that we feel or experience that are underneath the surface. And so there's
Sensory.
really like a look to autism. And so yeah, so once I got someone who was willing to listen and really I had already come to the conclusion, as I said, and a lot of people ask me, well, at this point, you're in your late 30s, why get an autism diagnosis? And for me, it was really just kind of explaining something that maybe I always knew I was different, but didn't know how. And, it helped me to just kind of grapple with that and understand my own life better. And of course, it was just so much better for my kids too, because once my daughter was diagnosed, a year later, my son got his diagnosis. And then eventually my oldest actually got diagnosed the latest because like me, she was a little bit harder to it took longer to sort of see sometimes she had more traits of ADHD and OCD, but then like other things became more clear as she got older. And I think sometimes that too is something that, we don't always see the same traits appear at the same time. Even in my own lifetime, I can say that as a kid, I was selectively mute and I didn't really talk to many people. But now here you hear me here on this podcast. I mean, I can do public speaking now, but back then that would have been terrifying for me, like to do anything like that. In high school, I couldn't do a speech in front of the class. And in college and grad school, I still had trouble. I was always that sort of student who's just sitting in the classroom observing more than speaking. And it wasn't until I started teaching that I started becoming more able to do things that were terrifying, like I said, for me when I was younger.
And did
Yeah.
you start teaching before your diagnosis?
Yes, actually, I was teaching I went right from my undergrad into my PhD program. So I've been teaching now for about 25 years and I've had my autism diagnosis for about 10. So it
Okay.
was quite a bit after that. I had already, my first teaching job was in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. So I graduated from my PhD program at the University of Southern California, took a position over in the UAE, had my first daughter was born in Dubai, and then I repatriated, had my other two kids. I had all three of my kids before I even knew I was autistic.
Mhm.
And then so it was interesting because I mentioned that at different points in my life, things were more challenging, with being an autistic mom with three, neurodivergent kids. That was extremely overwhelming in ways that I had no idea what I was getting into. And it became clear as I was struggling through all of that. Once I had my diagnosis and understood better, like the things that were really setting me off and making things more challenging for me, it really changed my life in a good way.
That's wonderful. That's amazing. And how do you, because you mentioned that you were teaching in Dubai, how does the culture outside of American culture view neurodivergent, individuals? Because I know in different societies, different cultures, it's viewed in a different aspect.
Yeah, since I wasn't diagnosed at that time, and honestly, my knowledge was still Rain Man at that time, because
Mm.
I mean, I always point to that because I know a lot of people in my generation, that is what they think of when they think of autism. And, as much as I now know about autism and, I advocate for myself and my kids, I like to be open-minded to other people who also were probably like I was just 10 years ago And, I meet these people all the time. They'll say, well, you don't look autistic, and your kids look like they're having fun on the playground. They don't look autistic. Those are the kinds of comments that you get. And I think of it as like, I need to educate other people about it. So when I was in the United Arab Emirates, I didn't know I was autistic. I didn't know that my kids were. I didn't know anybody that was autistic. Like, I literally just had Rain Man in my head as what autism is. If I saw a kid rocking back and forth or who didn't make eye contact and was flapping hands, I would be thinking autism. But other than that, I wouldn't be, because that's all I knew. I was very sort of, I don't know why. There's a lot of people now that are diagnosed, but back when I was growing up in my generation, there weren't. Usually, unless you had like a severe form of autism, you would be overlooked for a diagnosis. And there's a lot more knowledge about it now than there was. And I guess my sort of gap in knowledge, it didn't come until much late. My understanding, I mean, didn't come until much later in my life.
This leads into our next question. What are the daily challenges that neurodivergent children and adults face that you wish neurotypical population would understand? Because you keep mentioning like general population thinks of Rain Man or some other movie that focuses on, I guess, not the most stereotypical of what perception thinks of neurodivergent individuals are.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's really important is there's such a stigma still about autism. And a lot of kids, even my own kids, they're more willing to say things like, well, I have ADHD, or, just my daughter, my one daughter is actually dyslexic, and sharing that kind of thing in middle school is very open-ended. Like, I find that even one of my daughters said, like, you know, they sometimes know that someone's autistic in their school, but it's very, like, they don't feel comfortable talking about it. And so one thing that I always tell my kids, it's like, I want you to be proud of your autistic identity, because it is really part of who you are. And but I also don't want you to feel like you have to share that with everybody. So it's not something you have to share. And my last name and their last name is different on purpose. Once I started publishing, I did not change my name. I kept it for publishing reasons, but also I felt like it allowed me to, I wrote lots of essays about personal experiences with my children when they were younger, before they had a choice in whether or not that information was out there. So it felt like a good way to kind of protect them and allow them sort of that they could advocate for themselves. And I try to teach them that it is important to not feel, you don't want your differences are just differences. They're not deficits. And I try to educate them to believe that, and also to encourage that kind of discussion with their own, my daughters are in middle school now. So it's like, these are the times I think a lot of kids start talking about it. But
Yeah, of
there's so
course.
much stigma
Mm.
about autism. It's unbelievable how many people still think of, they think of it as being a whole other level than like ADHD or OCD or dyslexia, at least in the conversations that I have with my kids. And so trying to change that perception, that, autistic people often have so many different strengths that are, even well above and beyond what some neurotypical people may have. All three of my kids are gifted, for example, so they're gifted and they're neurodivergent. Not everyone that's neurodivergent is gifted, but there are so many people that are neurodivergent. Statistics now show that at least 1 out of 5 kids are neurodivergent, and
Oh wow, that's
almost
a
one in
huge
five
chunk.
are just dyslexic alone. And then you have
Wow.
autism, I think is 1 in 39 or around there. Um, it's a very, there's a lot of kids that have neurodivergent diagnoses now, and being able to recognize, I think the important thing is, when, like I said, there's a lot of people that don't have a lot of understanding of what neurodivergence is. Even the word neurodivergence confuses a lot of people. I usually just say it means different brain, like your brain is different, different brains, different, you do things a little differently. And I think that helps people understand a little bit more what that means. And everyone, like, if you think about a classroom with 25 students, 5 of those students are going to be neurodivergent. So pretty much
Mm.
everyone, like all kids, adults in their workplace, they're going to know someone who's neurodivergent, whether they know or not. So I think a lot of it is just trying to educate people about what neurodivergence is and what it's not. You know, it's not a deficit, it's a difference. And I think that, over the years too, I've had to like explain to employers, or well, only one employer actually, but my current employer knows, that I'm on the spectrum. I even had a letter that my psychologist wrote, and I, kept that close to me in case I ever needed to present it, to ask for accommodations and things like that. They've all been very helpful in that way, and I think that that's important too, to ask for what you need and hope that other people will be understanding of that. And I tell my kids too, you have to ask for what you need. I'm teaching them to advocate for themselves. Like I do the IEPs and the 504s, but then my kids, I tell them, you can ask for that too. I can ask for that for you, but you can also ask for that because, once I'm not around anymore, they're going to have to advocate for themselves. So I'm trying to teach them to be advocates.
No, definitely a good skill set to instill in children at a young age to be independent and, like you said, be their own voice, their own advocate.
In each book of your children's series, The Infinity Rainbow Club, you feature as the main character a child who is neurodivergent, ranging from autism spectrum disorder to OCD. How vital was it for you to make these characters relatable to both children and adult readers?
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting is that even though I have an autism diagnosis, I don't have an official ADHD or OCD diagnosis, but I identify as having those, partly because when I got my oldest diagnosed and I went through the criteria looking at, when she was getting her diagnosis, I realized that similar to when I was doing research on autism, that I also fit the criteria for that. One of the things that was a challenge as an author, though, is that I didn't want to misrepresent being less familiar with OCD and ADHD, not having the official diagnoses. So one thing that was great is that my publisher, when I asked them if they could have sensitivity readers, basically have someone who had more knowledge than I did about ADHD, OCD, and even autism to just give their feedback on the books that I wrote. And one thing that was interesting with OCD is that the reader thought that I did a good job of like showing the ways in which the main character Violet, her experience of OCD, but that the way that the adults interacted with her, they didn't find that to be as convincing or helpful for her. And what was interesting is that when I was a child, and I was thinking about the things like the ways in which I would obsess over things, and I didn't have any treatment. So it was interesting that someone else looking at it said, well, maybe the adults might interact with her a little bit differently. And it made me sort of see that perspective in a different way. So not just what I did as a child, but what would have been better for me to do as a child to deal with, my OCD. And so that was really eye-opening for me because that was the only one out of the three books that I got feedback like that because the other sensitivity readers felt that the autism with my main character Nick in book one was very authentic, and that was again like my main where I felt really comfortable writing about that. I had researched and lived it my whole life, and so that one was very easily. It came very easily. It was the most, I guess, it was the mostly based on my son and me, kind of the composite character Nick. And then, like I said, when I moved to Violet, but it was very easy to rewrite those scenes, just the interactions between the adults with Violet, because she interacts with her parents and her grandmother, and really it was just changing a few lines here and there and a couple thoughts and whatnot. It wasn't a lot of revision, but it completely changed the way that the adults in the chapter book responded to Violet's OCD in, I think, a much better way so that other people can learn from that, both the adults and kids. And then with ADHD, my main character Connor in book three, he's the book's about Taekwondo and the Taekwondo challenge. I have a black belt in Taekwondo, so I was drawing from my own
Oh,
personal experience with that, and also feeling like I think Connor out of the three characters is the way that he approaches his ADHD was very much my own experience because he's doing these forms or patterns of movement in Taekwondo. and he has a lot of trouble remembering the next move. And that was my main challenge in Taekwondo, because by the time you get to a black belt, you have all these forms you have to memorize and like be able to perform with. And so for me, the biggest challenge was that I was always better at the fighting part, like the the way in which you're sparring with other opponents, using your kicks, punches. But when it came to the sequences of memorized movements, it was extremely challenging for me. So I made that one of Connor's main sort of difficulties, because it's like he's testing for his black belt, and he messes up the first time and then he gets another chance. It's like, is he going to be able to do it? So yeah, I think that it was challenging, but I really felt like I got a lot of support from my publisher to get other opinions on the books. And of course, I also had my own sort of other readers that I knew who read the manuscript. And most importantly, my first readers were my kids. They were the ones that read these books before anybody else, my kids and my husband. And it wasn't just because I wanted to see how they reacted, but I also wanted to know what they thought about the ways in which they were very aware of the fact that these characters were based on them in some way. So they got to give me feedback. And sort of a funny story with my son is that when he had so the main character Nick in the Brick Builder Challenge, my son, um, he at first had some reservations and was like, "Well, wait a minute. Some of the mistakes that this character Nick, and his name is Nick as well, some of the mistakes that Nick is making, like." He's not doing things the right way. Like I'm a little offended that you put that that one scene where like the Nick did this and he shouldn't have done that, and I realized that, and I'm like, well, look at it this way. I said, look, if I made Nick this like character who, could do no wrong, everything he did was absolutely perfect. It was like, where would there be a story? There would be no story for Nick. He
That's
would just
true.
be
Hmm.
this character who knew everything, what to do the right way the first time. Because one of the main challenges in the book is that Nick doesn't want to have a partner. He wants to make his Legos the way he wants to make them, and he doesn't want the new girl to be his assigned partner. And so by the end, though, I told my son Nick, I was like, by the end, he is working very well with the new girl, and they win the challenge, and all these things that are really exciting that couldn't have happened if Nick hadn't sort of gone through this heroic trajectory throughout the book. And I said, Nick is a hero. And then my son was like, okay, leave it exactly the way it is. And I'm like, do you want me to change his name so that you don't have your name on it? He said, no, like I want to be a hero too.
Of course, who doesn't want to be a hero? We're all heroes every day in some format in our lives, right? Um, so our next question is, what advice would you give to parents when it comes to advocating for their children?
Yeah, one thing that I like to think about is a lot of times when we're in the struggle, and especially when I was a young mother, we're always thinking about all the things that we need to help our kids with, all the challenges that they have. And that's really important. We do need to do that. But I think we sometimes forget about all the strengths that our kids have and how we might be able to nurture them more. So like when I noticed that my daughter, my younger daughter, who was diagnosed first with autism, when she was 2 years old, she was putting together 100-piece puzzles. And so that was like one of the things too that made me realize that she was different. But I mean, we would build puzzles like she wanted to stay up all night doing them. I wouldn't allow that. But I mean, we would build puzzles like it was anybody's business, just like building these puzzles. And she wanted to rebuild the same ones over and over again. And that was fine because it was like that was a special interest of hers, and I nurtured that as much as I could. I even wrote a New York Times article about an essay that was related to that. Um, but in any case, every time that my kids, we build a whole playroom, put down like rainbow colored foam padding that's very similar to like in the book Nick and the Brick Builder Challenge. And my kids would build Legos. Like they would, every time they had like a holiday where they'd get a gift or something, it was a new Lego set. And that was one of their special interests. They're getting older now and have other interests that, go, in different ways. A lot of autistic people or neurodivergent people have special interests that change over time. But nurturing those, I think nurturing the strengths of my kids is really, I think, the best thing that I was able to do. They all play travel ice hockey now, which is interesting because it's just how did all three of my kids end up being just really good ice hockey players and loving it? but it's like that's their special interest right now, and I do everything I can. I spend so much time shivering in ice rings because my kids absolutely love it. And I think sometimes, and there are occasionally meltdowns and whatnot. I have had my son has stepped off the I like well not like sort of stayed on the bench longer than he should have before his shift and things like that. I made sure when it was appropriate. His coach knew about his sometimes his anger would take over and it would be hard for him to stay focused. So, we had to make accommodations for things like that, but it happens very rarely now because we kind of address those things as they came. But it's interesting how, like I said, a lot of parents that I know, they're thinking a lot about the ways in which there's challenges, and they're more worried about what's going to happen if I take my autistic child and they have a meltdown here or this happens. But honestly, it's like I've had my kids normally don't have meltdowns in public. That's fairly rare. So I will say that a lot of them have low support needs when it comes to autism. However, it does happen, and I think that we just need to be okay with that and deal with it when it comes, because if we just don't leave the house or do anything, that's not going to help our kids either. We need to educate other people about it's okay, to have like to be sensitive to lights. Sometimes we got to turn the lights off. Sometimes we got to remove ourselves from crowds. My son would rather be in an isolated hiking path than Disney World because he doesn't want all that noise and crowds and things like that. But we just have to make those accommodations and hope for the best that people will understand when, things come up.
Um,
Excellent. Next question. How crucial is it for children and adults of all disabilities to feel seen and included in all forms of media, whether it be TV, books, movies, etc.?
Yeah, I do think it's really important. And I mean, a lot of times sometimes when I'm watching different TV programs too, I'll think that someone feels like they may or may not be identified as autistic. Like there was a TV show that I used to watch that's no longer on, Bones, and Temperance Brennan, that character, I even wrote a piece for it in it was Glamour magazine. I wrote about how, the only woman that's like me on TV is basically Temperance Brennan. And it's because I really identified with her. And it was interesting because when I started doing some research, there was a suggestion that the character may have been based on someone who was, had Asperger's. So there was a little bit to it, and a lot of her interactions to me felt very authentic in that respect, but it wasn't something that the show itself emphasized. So I do think, though, it's important to have representation, and when possible, to have actors and people that are advising on the shows be authentic, like autistic, whether they're if they're on the spectrum. I think that is important to have authentic representation. Just like with books, it's important to have authors who have lived experiences writing books. I think sometimes like there's some characters that we hear about that they have issues with the way the representation is, because like I mean I'm not going to name a whole bunch of different shows. I think that I wrote a piece about Sesame Street and the Muppet Julia for the New York Times when that first came out, and that actually my kids were preschool aged at the time, and that was just, I thought, fantastic representation for kids. And I think we need more of that. And that is what's going to change the sort of perception of Rain Man, because again, that perception that is very much sort of part of the collective consciousness of what autism is, I think it kind of closed the door to knowing about a lot of other aspects about autism. And so now with more programming that's sort of opening that up and looking at other perspectives, that it doesn't just look like that, the more representation the better.
of course. Do you feel like in general the media is sort of catching on in terms of filling that void of bringing more different types of ability characters into the different platforms of media and content?
Yeah, I do think they are. I think there could be a lot more though, because a lot of times it's and I think we won't really reach that goal until it's just normal that you're going to see an autistic character and not have to be like the first autistic character in a setting with this,
Okay.
because at that point it's like you're almost trying to like um just meet a certain guideline, like, oh, we should have, one ability character in this show. Like when there's just someone, and that's partly what I was trying to do with my chapter book series. I didn't want just one autistic character. I've got an autistic character. I've got another autistic character who uses she has a tablet that she's using to communicate. And so a non-speaking autistic character, as well as another autistic character who does speak. And then I added in the third book a character who had dyscalculia. So he had challenges with math. And I have a character who has dyslexia and dysgraphia, so reading and writing challenges, which was based very much on my daughter's experience. But I wanted it to be a whole club, the Infinity Rainbow Club. If you're not familiar with the symbol for neurodivergence, it's an infinity rainbow symbol. So I created this Infinity Rainbow Club so that kids that had different abilities, different perspectives could all gather and share their experiences and not feel, so different in the ways that they do things in this club. So for me, that is really, I think, what, I think it would be great if there was a sensory gem that I have featured in the novel. If every elementary school had a sensory gem where kids could go and, um, decompress from the school day and things like that, I think that would be fantastic. And if we had more books with more characters that have all different perspectives, I think the more the better. So it's not just like, let's have an autistic character and then that's it. Only one person that's in the book that has that's neurodivergent. I mean, in a classroom, like I said, of 25 kids, about five of them are going to be neurodivergent. So like if you're showing these kinds of scenes in your books, I mean, it's more realistic to have more than one neurodivergent perspective.
So this is our last question. What do you hope readers gain from your books?
I hope that more neurodivergent kids can see themselves in my books, that reading this, that they're going to identify with the characters, and also the adults that might be reading them with them will also have a better understanding of their experiences. But I also hope that neurotypical kids will read these books and have better understandings of how to interact with their classmates, maybe a cousin who's neurodivergent. So I'm hoping that it will not only serve as like a way for neurodivergent people to understand themselves and other people better, but also for neurotypical people too as well. So that's really my main goal. Like I don't think of it as this is a book series just for neurodivergent kids. It's that was a big part of why I wrote this, but I really wanted to write stories where, the characters, they just happen to be autistic, but they're going on adventures just like anybody else. Like what kid doesn't want to read a book about a kid who's getting his Taekwondo black belt, or a book about a girl who's discovering dinosaur bones and like helping out with the she's helping out with the virtual, well, the they sort of have augmented reality. That was the word I was looking for. The augmented reality in the Natural History Museum. So she's, learning a lot about dinosaurs, and she just happens to be have OCD. So it's not so much about OCD. It's a book about dinosaurs, a book about a girl, that gets to volunteer at the museum with her classmates. So, and then the first book, Nick and the Brick Builder Challenge, same thing. Like what kids don't like to play with Legos? There's so many kids that do. And I'm hoping that by having stories that have just what I think of as just regular kids who just want to have fun, and then they happen to have challenges and they happen to think differently. But, that's kind of the whole point, that we don't really need to have a book that is just showing, sad experiences that, we don't need a book. It's fine to have a meltdown. I have meltdowns in some of the books I write, but it doesn't have to be the focus. It doesn't have to be about, all the bad times or the difficult situations. And I mean, really, even those times, other people can learn from that, because who hasn't had, a difficult experience at some point? It may not be an autistic meltdown, but I think a lot of kids that aren't autistic can understand when they see the thoughts of that character and what they're going through, they can kind of understand better, oh, I've had a bad day too, where something bad happened and I understand better.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jen. We appreciate having you here on the Sea of Stories podcast. It's been so informative, and the Ocean County Library is so honored and excited to be hosting you in July as part of our celebrations for Disability Pride Month. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to say to our Ocean County Library listeners through the podcast?
I would just say keep using your public libraries. That's such a great resource. And I couldn't be, have gotten where I am today, like being a professor, being an author, and also educating my kids without public libraries because they just have so many resources that, we can't possibly have just in our home libraries. So it really opens up their world.
Wonderful. And
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jen.
yeah,
Thank
thank you so
you.
much. We look forward to seeing you in July.
Yeah, I can't wait. Thank you so much.
All titles mentioned in today's episode can be found in our catalog and borrowed for free with your Ocean County Library card. We hope to see you next time. Until then, happy reading.